some minutes ago, actually an hour ago. So this is basically relative Big Mac prices in different economies, right? And I argued this is like a tough nut for purchasing power parity, right? You know, if you're married to purchasing power parity, you would argue, well, that's just a coincidence. But if we know Balassa-Samuelson, we understand why Big Macs are more expensive in rich economies than they are in poor economies. And so, also important, we would not interpret the currency of a rich economy to be overvalued just because the Big Mac is more expensive in that economy. And we would not interpret a currency of a poor country to be undervalued just because the Big Mac is cheaper. However, and this is the interesting thing, we have this huge cluster of relative Big Mac prices, and we have some countries where the Big Mac is conspicuously expensive. So in that economy here, why the heck is the Big Mac still relatively expensive, right? It should be down here. In this economy, the Big Mac is very inexpensive. Now, that's an interesting finding that Big Macs are cheaper in poor economies than they are in rich economies, but sometimes they are conspicuously expensive. And that has to do with the fact that in poor countries, sometimes McDonald's has much more market power than in rich economies. If you go to the United States, suburban Washington, you have millions of fast food chains, right? You have fast food chains that you've never heard of, right? You have Big Mac, you have McDonald's, and you have Burger King, and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Okay. Then you have Popeyes. You have, what do you have? You have Wendy's. You have, you know, you name it. You have all these fast food chains. So there's tough competition. In some other countries, you have just one fast food chain, and maybe you just have one fast food restaurant on the block or in the city. And when people go to that, they dress up, right? I saw that when I was in Poland in the 90s. There was a McDonald's, and people actually went there wearing a tie. Now, that means, of course, that McDonald's is something posh and exclusive, and they charge high prices because they target a very wealthy clientele. And so I would argue that this is a country where McDonald's has a lot of market power, right? And so they charge a very high price. Now that makes things even more complicated, because how do you identify over and undervaluations? It might be, the Big Mac might not be expensive because of an overvaluation, but it's just, you know, the market power of McDonald's in that economy. To make a long story short, the real exchange rate is a super interesting variable, and the more you go into it, the more you discover in terms of it's not just, you know, purchasing power parity. So I kind of warn you against using purchasing power parity naively to identify over and undervaluations. And currency traders know that, right? Now the first big argument against purchasing power parity is Balassa-Samuelson. That's what we've been talking about in the last hour or so. The second the next arguments are there's a lot of other stuff also driving relative prices. So identifying over and undervaluations is actually a challenge, more of a challenge than purchasing power parity suggests. Good. So what are the limits of the Balassa-Samuelson model? Now, are we done with the real exchange rate? The answer is nope, we aren't. First of all, fluctuations of the non-traded goods price considered to be the only source of the real exchange rate fluctuations. That's what Balassa-Samuelson suggests. In fact, when I was in Maryland as a graduate student, I attended courses by Guillermo Calvo, who was a famous macroeconomist of Argentinian origin. And Calvo was a brilliant mind, but he was not the best teacher, right? And he, you know, walked up and down. And then he said, As everybody knows, the real exchange rate is the price of non-traded goods over traded goods. And then he kept walking. And I thought, I don't know that. And I looked at the others and thought, do they know that? And everybody nodded. And I think everybody said, well, we don't actually know that. But what Caliber was essentially referring to, set this equal to 0, set this equal to 0, then you get the real exchange rate basically driven by this ratio, right? But that's not, I mean, we're making an assumption here, and we should be aware that this is an assumption and might not be satisfied in reality. So we do not allow for international price differences for traded goods. Secondly, where's the nominal exchange rate? It cancels out here. If we set this equal to 0, we're talking about stuff that is denominated in the same currency. So the nominal exchange rate has no role for the real exchange rate. And that's kind of weird. Because in fact, the real exchange rate is highly correlated with the nominal exchange rate. Secondly, the partial equilibrium nature of the model is its shortcoming. So how do changes in relative prices interact with other endogenous variables, like consumption, investment, the current account? Never ever be happy about partial equilibrium models, because in macro we should be, interested in general equilibrium. Everything's related to everything. By the end of the day, prices are somehow integrated into a whole thing of, consumption decisions, investment decisions, and so on and so forth. So there's more to say on the real exchange rate. And I have 7 minutes to do it, but I think I will not be able to do it in those 7 minutes. So let's see. Let's set the stage for what's to come by talking about price competitiveness. Now, price competitiveness is a very, glamorous term. Competitiveness, right? That's something that we want to have. We want to be competitive because, we want to be better than the others. Now, the real exchange rate is often interpreted as indicating the price competitiveness of an economy. And here's this quote from a Bundesbank website. The indicators of the German economy's price competitiveness are designed to measure price developments in Germany in relation to those of foreign competitors, taking exchange rate changes into account. This is like saying we're looking at the real exchange rate, because that's prices in the German economy, prices abroad, the nominal exchange rate. Now, this is a public website. They want to, they don't want to shock the public by talking about technical terms, so they talk about this and not about the real exchange rate, but implicitly they talk about that. The question I'm asking is, does this make sense? And the answer will be, as always, yes and no, or no and yes. In the end, fortunately, more yes than no. So it's like yes, yes, no. But there's a long way to go. So what we're going to do next is the following. We will dissect the real exchange rate, and we will dissect, so split into different parts, opening this thing, right? Because so far, we've just set it equal to 0. Now, this doesn't have to be 0 for reasons that you will see. And trust me, you will learn a lot from this, right? It will be kind of strenuous, but it's something that you will you will learn a lot from this. Now, the model that I'm going to present you, and I think I'm going to do it either this afternoon, but I think I'm going to do it tomorrow morning. It looks as follows. You have two countries, home and foreign. Each country produces a non-traded good and a country-specific traded good. And we assume that countries are exogenously specialized. That's the so-called Armington assumption. The Armington assumption goes back to a gentleman called Armington, who just said, okay, let's assume that country H produces H goods and country F produces F goods without explaining it. Why is that an assumption? Well, because and it's an assumption that macroeconomists love and that trade economists hate. Why do trade economists hate the Armington assumption? Because trade economists want to explain trade patterns. Trade economists want to explain why does Germany produce cars and Bangladesh produce t-shirts. Assuming that Germany produces cars because it's Germany and Bangladesh produces t-shirts because Bangladesh produces t-shirts is like making trade economists unemployed. The Armington assumption is popular among macroeconomists because it makes macro models much easier, right? Now, just to show you the direction where we're going, by the end of the day, we'll get this expression. And this expression will dissect the CPI-based real exchange rate into something that we already know, which is this, right? This is the stuff that we've been talking about this morning, plus some stuff that you haven't seen so far, which is a thing called the terms of trade and deviations from the law of one price for traded goods. And that's exciting stuff, and we need to put some to use some groundwork. So I guess finishing this presentation on the real exchange rate will take us another hour, and we don't have an hour now. But I will do it, right? And let me figure out how to arrange it. I think after the lunch break, I'll be back at 1. I might be slightly later today because I have to pay my bill, and I don't know whether I'm going to find that lady immediately. There is a problem set that I would like to talk about this afternoon, and the problem set looks as follows. It's one of these data problem sets, so it asks you to download the Thai baht's nominal exchange rate and the Thai baht's real exchange, and to compute the Thai baht's, actually it's the Thai baht's nominal exchange rate against the US dollar, so it's the US dollar Thai baht nominal exchange rate, and the second thing is to compute the US dollar Thai baht real exchange rate. If you never computed a real exchange rate in your life, it's good to get started, right? And then the next thing is about international income comparisons. That's what we're going to do this afternoon because you already have the basis. And the next thing is to talk about absolute purchasing power parity. And that's also something that you can do. The fourth thing is something that more or less relies on what I should have done, this next part of the lecture, so I probably will skip that. And maybe I'm using the very last part of this afternoon to do some lecturing. So it's gonna be intense, again, for all of us. Good. So please be back at 1, and please start working on this problem set. I'll come here and be available. And if you have questions, and then I'd appreciate if someone could, present a solution. And as I said, this data retrieval stuff, that's not high tech, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do it. But if you've never done it, then then you always shy away from doing it. And so it's very good to get started at some point. Good. Okay, so I close all these windows and close my computer and pay my bill.